Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News Australia. Today is Friday, September 19th, 2025, and we're going to be looking into how Australia has been viewing its new Labour government as of the election just a few months ago. Election Time News, your one stop for all things elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news. Subscribe for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian elections. Also, make sure for all the Substack threads, Instagram, and X, all of those, we are staying up to date on all of that. So, on news and keeping you up to date on your one source of political news. And also remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. So now moving on to the video. Now, one thing I do want to point out was I did try to officially fix my microphone audio. So please do let me know if you can actually hear me now, because it's been a little bit of trying to figure out how loud it should be and whatnot. It used to be way too loud, and then I got the new mic, and then all that. So I'm trying to figure that out. So let me know what you guys think about the volume in the comments. Thank you. So, the election in 2025 was the general was a bit of a blowout for Labor, quite a bit overperformed expectations. They had 77 seats and they got all the way up to 94, which is a 17-seat gain. The coalition lost 15 seats. The Greens lost 3. So it was quite a bit of an underperformance there, and the Labour Party gained 2 points in the primary vote. The coalition lost 3.88%. Independents actually ended up gaining 2, and in the two-party preferred, believe it or not, the Labour Party actually gained 3.09%, and this was after a while of the coalition being in the lead, and they actually did lead all the way up until the very end. Even actually the very last few polls, most of them had the coalition leading, but then they were basically perfectly inverted when you look directly at the percentage of the vote they got. The Trumpet of Patriots vote was relatively accurate. One Nation was somewhat accurate, as well as the Green and Other vote, but these two were perfectly split and ended up being a lot more competitive than it was looking like in January, which is almost the exact same thing that happened in Canada. So that is going to be that's going to be the relatively surprising result. But now we're looking at next is going to be the 2028 or so, potentially 2028 election. It might end up happening before that, but there's not much of a chance that there's going to be any no confidence votes or anything like that, like we saw a while back. But that was after. That was, in fact, after. I'm not sure exactly where it was, but strong seat in opposition, I believe it was just a timeout where they were required to do an election. So it's going to be on or before the 20th of May, 2028. And so now they have Dutton out in the coalition. They now have Susan Lee. And so I'm actually not 100% sure to pronounce the name. I'll check real quick. So it is in fact Susan Lee. So that is going to be a bit of a change for the coalition. And the main thing about the Labour Party is still being run by Albanese. That's going to be the continual leader there. But what we're looking at is, compared to the previous election, how might Labour be able to hold things together? So, though they do have a slight change in leadership, the Greens also have dropped Adam Bant since he lost his seat. The only person that actually has any seats is Larissa Waters, and that is in the Senate in Queensland. And then, of course, Katter's Australian is just run by Katter, one single person in that party. That's the House seat up here, right there in that's basically all there is for as far as that goes. 0.32% of the popular vote, I believe that says. Oh, it's an individual SVG file. This is going to be fun. All right, we can scroll way over here, all the way across the northern part of the country, and we can see that he got 0.33% of the vote. Got one seat right where he was, and he did end up winning that by quite a bit. He was the incumbent there. And then that Center Alliance, one seat, no leader there. Independents, no leader because they're all literally just independents. There are 10 seats. They actually had 13, but that was mostly because they left parties. So the last election, they won 10 seats. They didn't really lose or gain anything, but they did actually get over 1 million primary votes, which is actually quite a bit more than they had prior. If we look back in the 2022 election, independents aren't even actually listed here. So that's going to be the main thing of note there as far as that goes. Next up, we are going to be actually getting into the polling itself. So we have so far is a current chart, and this is not looking very strong. So Labor started off with more expected in this first poll, and that's going to be that starting point. And the coalition lost a little bit, but they actually gained a little bit of everyone else's expense. And so what we've seen since then is a slight and relatively considerable drop. They're still polling above the actual primary vote that they got in the election, which is definitely not terrible news. But the fact that they're still already starting to drop this early is a bit concerning. Interestingly, though, the coalition has been dropping as well, and they are considerably below where they were in the two most recent polls. It looks like to be about 27% support, and the other vote has been relatively consistent, but the One Nation vote has gone from basically where it was in the primary vote in 2025 earlier this year, all the way up to almost doubling, about 12% up from 6. So that's definitely going to be something to watch. The Greens kind of had a hill that they are now going down the other side of, but they're relatively stable as far as polling goes. The two-party preferred, this is somewhat concerning for the Labor Party, as this is relatively, something that you want to be able to see how are you against the main opposition group. And so they started off phenomenally. They kind of started dropping, but that was a bit closer to where they were in the actual election. But then they started going back up a little bit, had some better polls. But now they've been collapsing recently with some polls all the way down here, suggesting as low as 53% to 47%, which would actually be a gain. And now the two-party preferred vote is on the opposite side of where it was on the most recent election just a few months. That was 4.5 months ago, which really isn't that long for this sort of thing to happen, which is pretty quick as far as an overall change in opinion goes, and considering how close quite a few seats were, is relatively interesting. Currently, there's a lot of talk about emissions targets potentially going net zero by 2050 and more than 70% being cut by 2035. There's also talks of Israel continually going on, with Albanese being seen as having some double standards here, as specifically quoted by the article from The Guardian. So that's going to be the main thing there. Also, energy prices as well is another concern, and it seems that there's not going to be that many are continuing to support the Labor Party as of right now. If we look at the overall voting intention, then you can see that it peaked at about 59% right here in early July, and then peaked again in mid-August. But both of those are actually Demos AU. If you look, there's nothing new by Demos AU. If you look at Roy Morgan, they have continually said 57, 55, and you look at the recent one, it was 56.5. So it's not that much worse, Resolve, if you look back at the beginning one, is 56, and now it's at 55. So as far as the actual continuing to do my individual pollsters themselves, it's not dropping that much. But that's going to be the main thing of note there. You can see 55 to 44 here for the two-party preferred vote. That's going to be the main thing for that. It's down to 10, a lead of 10. It was 10.4%. So we are now down at the point where we're starting to see polls that are lower than the original count. You can also see a few more here, 53.5 for that poll there. But those are the only two that actually show a lower support than they received in the May 3rd election. Preferred prime minister, though, is definitely very strong in Albanese's favor. If you look at all the ones that did it, there's two by news poll, 52 and then 51, but both of those are a plus 20 net, so that's going to be the main thing there. Not much of a concern as far as that goes. Then you have the approval ratings here. You have plus 24, plus 11, and now we're down to single digits, which should be a bit of a concern for the Labour Party, especially Albanese in general. As you can see that his support is starting to decline. Meanwhile, Lay is, in fact, actually on the way up in general. That's not much of a trend, but -7 to +7, and then -2, -9, up to +2. There's quite a few undecideds, but that's not necessarily anything bad for the opposition. But this is something interesting since the election. It has continually been that the majority, a plurality of Australians say that the country is headed in the wrong direction continually. At one point, it was really good. It started to go up and then peaked, but then it has continued to start going back down. Now we're at -9, 16% undecideds, hovering around the 15 to 20% region for the most part, which should show some concern again for the Labour Party, considering how close some of these were. And pull up the results, but if you do pull up the results, but no, I didn't actually go through, and it's all the way up here, and it's in the thing right there. There we go. And that's not the results. If we look at there, no, wrong one. If we look at the actual all right, give me a second here. Oh, okay, it has a whole thing in there. All right. If we look at the actual results here, quite a few of these were relatively close. I don't have the actual file to show the margins, unfortunately, so this is just going to be safe versus anything else, but there's quite a few that were relatively close, and so there's a lot of ground to potentially be lost by these candidates. So that's the main issue with this, is going to be that there's a lot of ground to be lost, and that's going to be the main concern. There's not that much to lose as far as those seats go, because obviously if they end up losing quite a bit, then they're going to end up in a hole relatively quickly. They didn't win quite a few seats. I'm trying to pull it up. It's not being very cooperative right now. There we go. We did get the map up, so this is what the map was. We can pull it up. We have quite a few I can't pull up the actual map, but it's not even showing the margins. But here we look at we sort by the margin if it wants to update. There we go. And then we can get something like margin that's going to be pretty close here, 59, 52, 55, 51. That one was relatively close, 3 points in the two-party preferred. You do end up with 52, even 61 could be relatively close. 52 is another one that's relatively close there. That's in Deacon. Menzies, very close. Final result, Moore would be on the line there. 58 Bass it was a flip, so it could go right back. Could potentially end up having Dixon go as well. So there's a lot of potential to lose ground there. If we end up looking at the actual national polling, then what you see is New South Wales. You do have a narrow win there, just barely the two-party preferred vote, which doesn't necessarily isn't necessarily the number one priority here, but they do still have those numbers. We don't have any right across except for this one by resolve, which they did a bit after all across all the entire country in mid-July. But they haven't done a full one since. The other ones they have done have not included the two-party preferred, and Roy Morgan only does two-party preferred. So but we have seen already a drop. It was 59% right after the election for Labor, but now we're down to 55 for Roy Morgan. And look here, 55. It has continued to be 55 for Resolve. You can see 36 down to 34%. That's an 8-point lead in New South Wales. So that's going to be the main concern there, is going to be that you end up having already a lot of losses already in some of those regions. Already starting off in New South Wales, that was a 4-point win. Now we're up to that's a likely victory in New South Wales, but still, they want to potentially end up getting that's the wrong icon. Want to potentially end up getting a better option instead of it's not what they'd want to be seeing right now. So for the most part, it is still continuing downward. But again, you're going to want to... It's still gained, but you can see, again, if we look up at this graph, it is still slowly going downward. If that momentum continues, then you are going to definitely end up with some issues, especially with the general national two-party preferred. And we go over to Victoria, then you end up having 32 to 30. This is a very narrow lead, essentially the exact same that we had on election day. It ended up being a 10-point lead in the final, but that's still a very narrow win right now. That's 2 points. If you look at some of these seats down here in Victoria, then you end up with some narrow victories out over here. You actually have the entire area. In this region, I believe there's a few considered to be close ones. I didn't mean to do that. Obviously, central Melbourne's not going to be very close, but a few of these outer ones as well. McEwen, pretty sure, was relatively close. Some of these other suburban regions that Labor gained pretty well in recently. You also had what was expected to be the closest race in the entire election. Deakin was right there. So that was one. Menzies was also pretty close. So this is going to be a relatively contested region. The fact that it's starting to get close again isn't necessarily something that the Labour Party would want to be seeing at this moment in time. Queensland, you actually had Labour finally, or the coalition in general, finally with a poll in the lead. They actually had been losing, even though they actually gained won the two-party preferred on the election night. 27 to 37. That's actually a relatively strong win for this poll by resolve. It's actually continued to go up. So interestingly enough, in Queensland right now, you do actually have a win for the Labour Party by a safe margin. But in the two-party preferred by Red Bridge, which is the only one that they've done, so you don't have anything to compare it off of. Roy Morgan, right after the election, you do have a 5-point win for the Labour Party. Now it's down to just 4. So it is starting to, again, continue to trend downward. You can see in this region, there's a lot of the, a lot of LNP gains here. You have Griffith, other regions in that area, though. You have some of this area over here, which was expected to be pretty competitive, but then ended up getting pulled off by the LNP. So that's going to be the number one thing there to be watching for. But then you end up with Western Australia. You have relatively strong wins there, still continuing to do well as far as most things go, 10 points or more. Now, again, this is just to try to generally show where support might be gaining or not. And I know obviously the states don't really mean that much unless you're talking about the Senate. South Australia, very strong support, almost won by 20 points on election night. That's going to continue to be strong for the Labour Party. Now, they are losing. Again, you could see that peak was in late June to late July. Now, since then, it has been continuing to trend downward a bit. They are right about where they started, but they peaked at 62.38. So that's going to be another thing to keep an eye on. And then finally, Tasmania, where we had an election there relatively recently, where the Liberal Party narrowly ended up polling a plurality in the government there, most likely set to go for another no confidence vote over the next few months. But You can see they actually have been generally continually going down 61% right here. And now they're actually about where they started again in the two-party preferred vote there. So that's kind of backwards as far as things go in Tasmania. But that is still actually basically the strongest margin that they end up with. And then neither of these actually have any polls. But these are mostly very, very safe. There's not many people out here in the Northern Territory, not many in Western Australia either. But ACT is never really competitive for the most part. It's just a lot of central urban areas out over in this area. So that's going to be the main thing there. But anyway, these were one not even close to competitive. Those were safe from the start. So essentially across the entire country, Labor had gotten strong gains, but now all of a sudden we're turning back around and they actually have individual seat polling, but only in Bradfield. Liberal versus Independent in June, and that was actually a win by the Independent by the narrowest of amounts, so that's why they were looking at that in the first place. That was the closest election in the entire country right there. It was an independent gain from the Liberal Party, and you actually literally have what looks like a 50-50 split perfectly. But then you actually had Liberals gaining on the Independents by quite a bit, 37.3 to 33%. But of course, what mattered is the two-party preferred vote. And if you look, that's actually quite a bit of a gain from the primary vote not that long ago. If you look at women versus men, you can see the women are generally a bit more labor supportive. And so that's also going to be something interesting to see. And you can see the older population is a bit more supporting of the Liberal National Coalition there. So that's going to be another thing to watch as far as that goes. And we end up with is the youth vote is actually very strong for the Labor Party. Middle aged a bit closer, but now what you see is 50 to 64 has been a bit of a swing towards the coalition here, 49.5 to 50.5 as of the most recent poll. So that's a bit of a shift as well. This kind of had a bowl in the middle. Interestingly enough, same thing over here, but they have gotten stronger. So this is going to be mostly what might be driving some of it as well. So that's going to be the conclusion for the final update there. The concern, obviously, being that the Labor Party didn't win by huge amounts in quite a few seats, especially in some of these suburban areas. You have, a few regions across the country in Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, especially outer Sydney as well, where they didn't have huge margins by any means, so they're trying to hold on to those races where they can. They still did relatively well, obviously, in 2025, but continuing with this two-party preferred trend would not be preferred for the Labor Party as they're trying to hold on to a lot of these seats that they basically narrowly ended up holding on to in the first place. A lot of these are, I don't know why on earth it's not actually working. Why on earth it's not, but Fremantle as well, Bullwinkle, Bean, a lot of these relatively close or very close races across the board. So, thank you all so much for watching today's video. Make sure to leave any information you have in the comments, your ideas. Make sure to keep it civil, though. Anything you want to see, make sure to subscribe below for more content like this. And thank you all so much, and have a fantastic rest of your day.